Hello everybody and welcome back to Essentially Explained for another video here on the channel. Today we're talking about the crazy cryptocurrency world in which we might be heading towards. What is a cryptocurrency? What are the negatives? What are the positives? And could we ever envision a world in which cryptocurrency is the sole universal currency that we all use to buy and sell, essentially? And as always, to help me along this journey of discovery is Dan Marks, our resident expert in everything economics and political. And Dan, how are you doing on this? Well, I was about to say wonderful Friday evening, but it's rather grey and dreary outside. So I guess how are you doing on this grey and dreary Friday evening?
I'm very grey and dreary, I guess. No, I'm not really. Marvellous. As we said, we're going to dive into the world of Bitcoin and Dogecoin and all the other ones, and hopefully try and make sense of it all, because it seems to have just blown up, isn't it? I mean, cryptocurrency's been around for a while. We've known about Bitcoin. Bitcoin's been around since the early 2000s, but especially in the last couple of weeks, it's all that everyone's talking about, isn't it? So it just seemed like the right time to sort of discuss it ourselves, really, from the very economic point of view.
Well, I mean, we say economic. I mean, I was about to say not really economics, it's just speculation. But at the end of the day, I guess economic theory is just a load of what our best guesses about how everything works. You know, it's not necessarily an accurate model. No economic model is 100% correct because there's so many variables that you can't model. It's the same with cryptocurrency. In fact, we know even less about cryptocurrencies because of, in the grand scheme of things, cryptocurrencies are still in their infancy even. You say they've been around since the mid-2000s, but in reality, they felt like they've only been around or prominent in the last 5 minutes or so. So what we know, what we think and know currently about them could be very different from in the future, which I think is where we're going to sort of look at this perspective-wise. We're going to look at, obviously, at the current drawbacks and positives. If you suddenly, for example, I don't know, you had a global supreme world leadery thing, you decided to change everything to a cryptocurrency. The negatives and positives of that are obviously a lot more negatives than positives if you suddenly just changed everything overnight. But also looking at it in a more realistic sense, over time, could we see this becoming a feasible alternative to our current system of having a load of currencies in different economies that you trade for each other to buy goods and what have you? But before we get into that, perhaps, and as Dan said in our last take, because this is our second or third take because of audio issues, what is a cryptocurrency? If you've been living under a rock, well, at a base sense, a cryptocurrency is pretty much a modern alternative online-only currency. Very much different to, say, a pound or a euro that you can get at your local currency exchange. And essentially, you can gain these cryptocurrencies. You can mine for, say, Bitcoin or any of the others. I'll be honest, my knowledge of the whole Bitcoin market's a little bit vague. I think Dan knows a couple others beyond Bitcoin, but Bitcoin's the one I know the most about.
Yeah. So you've got, obviously, the other ones that are talking about, like, you've got some that are based on memes. So you have Dogecoin. That's quite a funny one. That's the one with the dog. That one's quite flat. You've got, what other ones do people normally trade? You've got Litecoin. You've got another variant of Bitcoin called Bitcoin Cash. You've got one called Dash. You've got Ethereum or Ethereum. I can't remember exactly how you say it. You've got, what other ones have you got? Tether is another big one. There's tons of them. And they're all created for their own various reasons.
Yes, all have their intended purposes, but I think by and large, Bitcoin is the most widely accepted.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even up till recently, even reputable companies like Tesla were accepting Bitcoin instead of, paying in dollars for their cars. Now, we'll get into why. Tesla then decided, or the people in charge of Tesla, so Elon Musk and the rest of the board, then decided that they wouldn't be doing that. Now, there's a couple of reasons we'll get into why, beyond the fact that Bitcoin can be rather unstable, perhaps even more than a currency, because you don't really pit it against other currencies. You pit it purely against market demand for it, which we know is rather volatile. In many cases, but especially for Bitcoin. And we've got to say a few talking points to go through. So perhaps we'll start with the drawbacks, or one of the big drawbacks of cryptocurrency. And you were saying, I think we were arguing beforehand, Dan, about the transaction costs, right, of Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's the main advantage.
Yeah. Now, in the long term, it could be an advantage. It could reduce the potential transaction costs if you have a universal currency, because you don't have to exchange it for other foreign currencies. But as of right now, as of with the current infrastructure, I think, Dan, you were talking to me about how the infrastructure existing isn't good enough to deal with a massive influx of demand for Bitcoin, and it actually costs more for transactions currently to take place in Bitcoin than with traditional currencies. So perhaps we could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so you might be sitting there thinking, especially if you do trade cryptos, you might be sitting there thinking, oh, well, that's a load of rubbish. It's so easy to go and buy Bitcoin. I can do it on my phone in 2 seconds and it costs nothing. That's true, but remember, we're talking from an economic sense here. So at the moment, it's very easy to get hold of Bitcoin or Dogecoin or whatever it is you trade, because it's cheap and easy to get hold of in a market. But if we're to use this as a currency, which is the whole sort of premise of this video, then, well, businesses have to be able to access it. They have to be able to buy it through, or loan it out or lend or borrow even, of course. And that means they need to be able to very quickly engage in quick transactions that simply the Bitcoin infrastructure can't facilitate. I mean, I'm not gonna. Well, what I'll do is I'll link the articles we're using in the chat in the description box. But essentially, the actual infrastructure used, the sort of main blocks for Bitcoin at the moment, simply aren't big enough to cope with the number of transactions used in everyday life for normal currencies. So I think one study found that the sort of average Bitcoin infrastructure can take between sort of 3 and 7 transactions per second in 2017-18. That might obviously have been improved now, but in comparison, the Visa infrastructure can take over 1,000, well over 1,000. It could be into the multiple thousands of transactions per second. So quite simply, at the moment, the Bitcoin cryptocurrency infrastructure isn't really good enough to cope with the sort of level of transactions carried out every day. And yes, the other one is the price of transaction costs. And normally, as Martin sort of alluded to, and I did, the transaction cost of Bitcoin is very low. It's in the cents or pennies, but there's massive amounts of range. The average Bitcoin price or transaction of the cost could take place between somewhere about 28 cents and all the way up to several dollars, maybe $13 per transaction. When you consider if you go and tap your card in a shop, it's pretty much free. Very few ATMs charge you to take cash out these days. The only time you normally get charges for borrowing cash is when you're using a credit card, or of course you're using your currency overseas, because obviously you have to convert it into another currency. So cryptocurrencies, if we were to use the same sort of infrastructure as we have now, on the general sense for the whole world, it would be extremely expensive for businesses to take part in transactions, but not just internationally, but even domestically, because of course the currency is the same. So right now, cryptocurrency in general simply isn't good enough, it isn't cost effective enough for businesses. But as we've said, if we assume that Bitcoin or whatever it will be becomes the mainstream currency one day through some sort of illegal, well, not illegal, but all powerful benevolent dictator, well, not benevolent because he'd probably be an idiot, but if that was to be the case, then of course, well, we would see some sort of regulation and business costs fall. But right now, it simply isn't good enough.
No, you're absolutely correct. As of now, if it was to happen overnight via this benevolent dictator, God knows who it would be.
Me.
Oh, well, the world is doomed then, if that was to be the case.
Right.
I think everyone would be very much looking for the local Quran, Bible, whatever, if they saw you coming to charge. They would look to God for guidance in that case.
I am the second coming of Jesus, because I am him. Oh God, that sounds getting flagged, isn't it? Oh no.
Right. I've got the editing booth, it's fine. We can remove that. It's all good. But yes, no, I'm in complete agreement that as of right now, it would be unrealistic to have a set universal cryptocurrency, not simply because of the massive investments and infrastructure we require, and the technology perhaps is not the standard we require to have a universal cryptocurrency system, but also because that technology, even the technology at the moment, in certain developed countries is at that level, that technology that exists isn't universally used. You know, it would be very much. I think we were talking about earlier actually that currently 2% of accounts control 95% of Bitcoin. And I'd imagine that all of that 2%, or the vast majority of that 2%, are in developed nations. You know, in rural areas of developing countries, they wouldn't have the access to technology to be able to access Bitcoin. You know, I think if you were to do this, you'd have to do many years in the future after, you know, there's a relative convergence that's already occurred across many economies. You know, at the moment, we've still got many economies in different stages of the sort of life cycle of an economy. I can't remember the exact name.
A low steady state growth model.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. But, you know, you still have economies still very much in the early stages of that, or that are just coming around to industrialization. You know, and you have other currents, you know, other economies even that are sort of flatlining. You know, they've reached, if not, you know, with current technology is full development, or very close to it anyway. You know, you see economies like Japan, you know, flatlining population, what have you, because the technology means that you know you can't grow because your labour is restricting your capital advancement. For whatever reason that's happening, and that's a whole different topic of debate we could talk about another time. But in a hypothetical scenario, you could see this happening in many years of time, but it would require massive international cooperation that does not exist currently. You know, you cannot envision US, you know, China, Russia all agreeing to having one set cryptocurrency. You know, the political climate would not allow for that beyond anything else for that not to happen. I don't know if I'm sort of being right of that assumption that, you know, it would require a load of things to go right in order for it even to get off the ground, essentially. It's cryptocurrency idea.
Yeah. I mean, there has been an attempt to fix currencies before, several attempts, in fact. You know, you had the gold standard, which was essentially pegging it to a convertibility of gold through the dollar and so forth. And then you had the Bretton Woods Convention in the 50s, which was an attempt to essentially pin all the world's currencies. Oh, sorry, 1940s. Sorry, mistake there. To essentially pin all the world's currencies to a sort of flat rate, which was divisible by the dollar. These were obviously again back through gold, so in this case it had some weight to its value. In the case of Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies in general, it's very hard to say what the actual value will be pinned to, because obviously fiat currencies retain their value in their sort of backing by the government. Really, that's their main value. If the world, or they become what we call legal tender, it means that everyone in the country that you live in or the world has to accept it legally, and so you have a reason to trust it and it retains its value. But a cryptocurrency as it stands is not legal tender. Companies do not have to accept it. Most companies don't at all. Obviously Tesla at one point did accept it, and obviously Elon Musk recently famously pulled out and said that he wouldn't do that anymore because of fears over the environment and how it potentially harms the environment, cryptocurrencies in general. So of course it loses its main sort of idea as like a unit of exchange, sort of like this idea of being able to exchange goods and services through this sort of mechanism, as sort of like a conversion mechanism. Obviously a Bitcoin world would not be quite the same. You wouldn't have it'd be unlikely to see this flat rate across the whole world, but it's very difficult to see any other way. It could be that some countries adopt different cryptocurrencies. So obviously the stronger, more OECD nations like the US, potentially some Western European nations like, of course, France, the UK, Canada, obviously in North America, possibly they could adopt the more sort of valuable cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. Maybe the poorer nations who need to maintain a more devalued currency, they could go for something cheaper like Dogecoin. And of course that would sort of eliminate the real benefit of having a single currency. So there's not this clear idea yet anyway that cryptocurrencies would offer any sort of advantage over traditional currencies. But yeah, there have been attempts to fix currencies before. They didn't go very well, especially for countries that were essentially massively harmed by the really poor conversion rates. So yeah, it would create chaos in my opinion.
Well, there's a couple of things I just wanted to sort of pick up from what you said there. First of all, the one thing I don't understand is how would be like obtaining cryptocurrencies? How does that damage the environment? Because I'm not so sure how does
Well,
online currency do that?
so from what I can remember, Elon Musk is obviously, as we know, is a sort of strong advocate for green technology. He doesn't like this idea of harming the environment, and he came out and said that um, that essentially cryptocurrencies, in particular Bitcoin, offers some sort of environmental impact. From memory, the studies say that well, each transaction consumes a large amount of electricity. Don't forget, we have to mine for Bitcoin, which is a very intensive process. It takes months at times. And I'm just reading a study here that's apparently a single Bitcoin transaction could power the average US household for a month. As we say, the whole Bitcoin network can process about 7 transactions per second. And that's because it is essentially so high power at the moment, and there's such complex computational problems to be solved that could never be done by hand. And so it takes a huge amount of electricity to do that, and obviously that comes at harming the environment. Obviously that would improve, it's Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general are still, as you say, in their infancy. They've been around some more than 10 years now, but when you consider how long currencies in the form that we think of them, the pound has been around for hundreds of years. Currencies in general have been formed thousands of years ago, or units of exchange or account. And they don't require electricity in any form. Well, obviously today through digital, but back then they didn't. Cryptocurrencies in general, because they're so hard to maintain and source through mining, take a lot of environmental power through electricity. So I think that's the main point there.
Yes, I mean there'd be a couple of counter arguments to that. Firstly, a lot of more of our energy is being sourced, sustainably, or at least from renewable sources. I read somewhere that 98% of Norway's energy comes from renewable sources. UK, US, and a number of developed nations are very much heading towards having, net carbon zero emissions. Also, with the advancement in technology, you would imagine that the processing power required to conduct these transactions would reduce over time. Now, I agree that currently, yes, it's impossible, essentially, would launch the world into chaos. But actually, there's another idea you brought up, which I quite like, actually, the whole of having like different almost cryptocurrencies or standards of cryptocurrencies for different sorts of economies, in different phases of development, as you will, or their by level of income or whatever, or wealth. It'd be the equivalent of, I guess for the most developed nations, be the equivalent of their cryptocurrencies being worth, say, the equivalent of £50 notes, and for other nations, perhaps less developed, the equivalent of a £5 notes. You know what I mean? It obviously would be more complicated than that because you have to take a load of things into account. How do you measure? Well, obviously, we can measure development, through HDI and what have you, but there's still a level of subjectivity. I can get the words out of my mouth in measuring it. Well, you can tell it's definitely a Friday if I'm struggling with my English, let alone economics. Economics I've done for a few years now. English I've known my entire life, and I'm still struggling with it. And I think I don't know. I think it's an idea worth looking to in the future. Not of now. I think the history, any ideas of introducing it now would not be possible. Also, I think you said earlier in the podcast you would require a huge amount of regulation. I think we looked at the statistics earlier. 46% of all transactions in 2019 via Bitcoin were for illegal purposes. Now, with the proper regulation, obviously you would imagine that to significantly decrease. But again, that requires massive investment. It requires massive international cooperation that currently doesn't exist. I think the whole idea of a universal cryptocurrency relies on an also idealistic economic world, which, let's be honest, is not going to happen for generations. And that's being rather generous. I think if humanity even lives that long, it depends on your view on how long humanity will live with current climate change. But again, that's another topic for another day. Another problem would be education systems. I've got a very limited knowledge of Bitcoin. Dan knows a little bit more than I do. But the vast majority of people, they would have heard the name Bitcoin and that's it. If that. what is a Bitcoin? You'd have to educate people about the whole system of Bitcoin, how it, a base level of how it works, so they won't, be left in a situation where they're left out of pocket. Even those that are meant to be experts. I think you were telling me before we started this podcast that a man was given accidentally $200,000 roughly in Bitcoin, just like that. Even for those that are meant to know, it's still immensely complicated. I think.
So let's just deal with them problems in hand, because you're going on like a fucking machine gun. Jesus. So yeah, we start with the environmental problems first. You said that Bitcoin may be sourced from renewables, and that's true. There is the idea that maybe most of the renewable energy is exhausted through Bitcoin, or perhaps most of Bitcoin's energy exhausted from renewables, whichever way you look at it. Yes, that's true. But mining, which is the main process by which it comes about, normally takes place from memory in sort of more less built-up areas, more sort of rural areas, where, of course, electricity is cheaper through more dirty energy. So, of course, that's bad. And then you have to consider, what was the next one you said? It was about this idea of like different exchange rates for different parts of the world. Again, there's the advantages that you could have things like clubs of countries. You'd see like unions almost, like you have a European Union. That could be good. Yeah. But there are problems even with the European Union method of currency, where obviously it doesn't quite suit every country as well as it should. And obviously the main problem with that is, if you have a currency that's widespread over so many different countries, there needs to be some sort of central authority and control of it, which is one of the big disadvantages of Bitcoin or cryptos in general, is that, well, central authorities cannot control its sourcing, its how it comes about. They can't control how much is in supply. Bitcoin theoretically can be limited in supply. It's in its code. However, of course, that doesn't really help us when no one is in charge of it. It's left completely to market forces. It is quite literally an Adam Smith wet dream of the invisible hand. It would be completely down to the markets to how Bitcoin was distributed and how much was in supply and in distribution in general. So obviously, if there's deflation, inflation won't be such an issue, but especially if deflationary fears or there was a need for expansionary monetary policy, it'd be very difficult for central banks to implement that if they can't control the source.
That would be my solution to that, just really quickly. I would have, in this world, hypothetically, a globalized central bank. Okay, now this is required on the assumption of them having perfect information that, as we know, doesn't exist.
In which case, you might as well end your argument right now.
But if you actually look at the modern world, we're as close to perfect information as we've ever been historically. And I think with the transparency and this is relying on a number of assumptions like the corporation and what have you. You could have a universal central bank that sits there and obviously can intervene in these different like regional markets, or you can even have the regional central banks that report to a global central bank that introduces almost like limits on the value of the Bitcoin or on the cryptocurrency, so you don't have these massive swings in inflation or deflation or what have you, the value of the currency.
Yeah, I can see what you mean. I get the idea. Complete crap. Because, firstly, the world would never agree to a centralized bank for the whole world. We have something similar to that in the form of the IMF, the World Bank, and essentially it's not bad at what it does, but it has no real monetary power in the sense of it can control the supply of currencies. Of course, it could issue loans and do help with balance of payments and things, but realistically, every country in the world is not going to sign up to a centralized bank because it would always favor the richer countries over the poorer. And you'd have so many issues with convertibility and fairness and equality. Never going to happen. Moving on. Well, what was the next point? It was about. So you went on from that. What did you go on about next? It was something about. What was it next? I forgot now.
So I think we also I went on to some negatives as well. So I talked a little bit about regulation and about how currently a lot of it's done for illegal purposes. I think I mostly talked about that. A couple other negatives.
We can work on that one. I'll be the devil's advocate here for you once. So I'll jump to the sort of rescue of Bitcoin here. Now, there is, yes, a lack of regulation and a lack of general supervision of the cryptocurrency world at this point. There isn't really an authority that oversees it. However, even the transactions of Bitcoin at the moment are still subject to general financial conduct regulations in the UK, and obviously the Fed Reserve Bank sort of regulations in the US. For example, if you use Coinbase, which is a very common one people use for cryptos to trade on, you still have to undergo basic checks for things like your identity and things like that. But theoretically, it would be very easy, or something would be difficult. And we're not advocating it. Let's be clear here. Let's just say that for a start. It wouldn't be difficult to launder or even embezzle funds through cryptos, which is the big problem here. And I would almost certainly, in fact, I would put money on it, quite literally, that there would be a big crash, a very 2008 style crash, but obviously different in nature because Bitcoin is very different to mortgages. Similar to that, because of a lack of financial regulation, it would be going for a lot of hurt again because of how sort of unregulated and volatile Bitcoin is. Let's try and think of another advantage of the sort of crypto world. Well, we said that obviously one of its main advantages at the moment was business costs, and also, of course, anonymity. The idea that, well, at the moment, when you go into a bank now, or you use a bank account, obviously it shows up as your name and who conducts the transaction. And eventually,
here's a problem with that, though. Yeah.
Oh, can I explain the point first? So the idea that anonymity, how you say it, is offered because, well, it's very hard to trace who trades these Bitcoins. That's a positive in terms of personal security. But yes, as Martin was about to say, there's a huge disadvantage to that, which he will explain now.
Yes, I was about to say, if you want every transaction to be anonymous, then obviously that's much harder to regulate for regulators. Also, I just wanted to sort of slightly return to your previous point about regulation. If the world wasn't going to agree to a universal central bank, surely it would be just as difficult to have a sort of universal regulation, or even regionalised regulation, because we found that's rather difficult to please everyone in regional institutions like the EU. You can't please everyone. And as in regards to the whole anonymous side of things, you wouldn't exactly be making it more difficult for people to carry out those illegal activities via Bitcoin. Well, I think you would have to create. I think maybe you'd have some sort of level of anonymous or anonymity, or however you say it, to reassure consumers. But I think that would even have to be like a facade. You'd still have to track and trace people's transactions to a certain.
Oh God, don't say track and trace. Oh, no. Failure of that. Geez, that's another topic anyway. Track and trace.
Yeah.
Indian variant. I'm not saying anything.
Yeah, well, this is all getting cut because don't want the algorithm doesn't like us anyway. I don't think that would help.
Yeah, so Martin is right. Obviously, yes, this anonymity doesn't help, and regulation, of course, would be much harder to achieve in a world where you couldn't agree on a central bank. That's all very true, but I can't really argue that because it's true. But my main issue is with the entire premise. Your conclusion isn't wrong in that it would be very hard to get regulation without a central bank, but I just don't think there would be any regulation in the first place. Although,
or a central bank in the first place, yes.
Or exactly, there would be very little governments could do. However, we live in a very strange world at the moment where central governments have a surprising amount of power. I mean, at the moment, if you think about it in the UK in terms of COVID, till very, very recently, literally a few days, the government with relatively little form of legislation or real enforcement or real weight behind the law, they've been able to essentially dominate our lives and how we live through simply speeches and essentially commands issued from the government with very little legal backing. So in a world where their word is taken seriously, they could use what we call soft power to try and essentially artificially essentially manipulate the state of cryptocurrencies. The Bank of England is very known for doing this right now. It very rarely or doesn't very often resort to actually using the base rate or other forms of monetary transmission to actually affect the value of the pound or inflation or whatever, or the sort of convertibility. But it does use what we call a lot of soft power, particularly Mark Carney used it, where it just says things to try and influence the markets and how our currency behaves. So if governments were seen at least to appear to be in control of the situation, there's obviously that way that they could act and to try and intimidate markets, to try and possibly scare them off during a potential bubble or encourage more activity during a downturn. But I think the world could call its bluff pretty quick when it chooses to ignore the governments and continue trading when it really doesn't want them to, and people would realize the government has no real power. So yeah, you can't really argue your way around that one. It's very hard to anyway. Moving on, I guess we sort of weighed up the disadvantages and advantages, but they're the main ones. There's plenty more. I'm sure you've got plenty more to go, but we really want to hear your opinion as well. Obviously, cryptos in general, but obviously now we have to focus on its feasibility as a currency in general. Can we imagine a world where we all go around trading Bitcoin? Because at the moment, it's only used really, let's face it, for financial gain. Very few places in general in the world accept cryptocurrencies, especially Bitcoin. Very little. I think that's the only one that's accepted, even by a handful of companies. Can we see a world where potentially we just trade using that? Well, you have to consider, is there really a need for it? Does our form of digital currencies that we use, the pounds and dollars through cards and bank accounts, is it fit for purpose? And I would argue in general, yes. The world in the last sort of 5-10 years particularly has adapted quite well to this sort of more digital world of banking. So is there a huge need for Bitcoin to take over? Possibly not, but that could change if cryptocurrency becomes more and more popular, and perhaps major financial institutions and companies start to use it as a way of storing value, or a way of backing their financial assets. And well, we could see a world where this becomes an increasingly commonly used form of what we call a store of account, essentially holding some sort of value. But I think the main problem with it at the moment is it's just far too volatile, isn't it, really?
Yeah, I mean, I could literally sum up the evaluation in one word, and that's no.
Yeah.
I think it could potentially in the future allow for a very globalized and collaborative global economy to be closer to, true optimization in terms of efficiency, productivity, and all that. But there's more pressing issues in the world than maybe making a very, very small percentage gain in these things that we wouldn't even see for a long time, because as we established in our sort of comparison of negatives and positives, if you try to do it now, you wouldn't end up with anything really. You just end up with a flaming wreck of a global economy, and that's in the best case scenario.
Yeah.
The world needs to collaborate. I think it does come up to the point the world needs to collaborate more, but to dealing with poverty and inequality, social inequality, and all these sort of things, rather than looking at cryptocurrency, which, let's be honest, as we established earlier, would be in the same scenario of making the rich richer, and you wouldn't really be helping the poor out because they wouldn't have the access to the technology. So in conclusion, as I said right at the beginning of my evaluation, no, there's no need really to do it.
Yeah, as I can pretty much agree with that. No.
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 I think our former economics teacher would be like, more detail required in that evaluation. But I think
that's all that needs to be said at this point. You can argue till the sun goes down. We just simply don't know. We're economists. We normally don't know anything. We're famous for getting things wrong and predicting. Literally, we might as well try and shoot down a meteorite in space, or try and find the center of the universe on a space hopper, or try and, I don't know, find the next unicorn. I mean, that is pretty much the accuracy of our economic predictions. They're always wrong. There's no one ever gets these things right. Cryptocurrencies are hard, even from an economic perspective. They're so unreliable and so volatile. No one knows, and it's very likely that we never will. We talk about this realistically. Bitcoin's just blown up in the next few days. It's likely to calm down at some point. I'm sure Bitcoin will have another rally at some point, and the bubble will burst again, and it will come back round. But I don't see a world in the immediate future anywhere we're going to have to worry about this. For the moment, just sit back. Don't listen to these people in turtlenecks with glasses on saying they made loads of money overnight on Bitcoin, and just enjoy it, really. Don't go stupid, and treat it like you would with any other financial asset that you trade for profit-making purposes. Yes, okay, it represents an ability or certainly an opportunity to make money, but be responsible, really, is all we can say.
The best thing, the only thing I can say add to that is if you're ever going to make an investment, and this is not just in Bitcoin in general, be as well informed as you can about that particular, whether that be a financial investment, because going in without the necessary knowledge is just a recipe for disaster. Moreover, I just wanted to actually, some of your comparisons with economic economic predictions, being closer to, finding the centre of the universe and all that. I like to liken, economist predictions to finding the true purpose of humanity, or the purpose of the universe.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you're putting a guess out into the dark, essentially, and if it hits something, then brilliant. But there's more important things to be worried about. Like this cryptocurrency, we simply don't know. And there's more informed people than us, and even they would probably struggle to give you an accurate prediction. Although they'd probably be a lot more accurate than we ever would be.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, we're just two blokes sitting in front of our computer desks who happen to do an economics degree, just babbling
Well,
on.
I'm not even I'm a fake economist, I'm a part-time economist. Martin's a full-time economist and he doesn't know. Don't ask me. I'm a philosopher as well, remember?
Well, you're the only one that we could take on with your application, because you were the only application for this role.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was just the least worst, because I won by default. So, listen to me because I am your overlord. All right.
We all bow down to Dan Watts, and on that bombshell, if that's not copyrighted, I hope it isn't. On that nutshell,
Time to end.
it is time to end. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.